And that is, do I know of any projects for volunteers? Unfortunately, I know only projects for volunteers.
Okie do.
So if there are any of you who would like to be involved in any art, architecture, urban-related voluntary projects, if you wait to the hospital. I forgot to tell you we have a rather formal opening so that it can be reused again, so please understand. Welcome to Inside New York's Art World. I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein. New York is indisputably the art center of the world, the premier training ground for new talents and the most desirable showplace for those already well established. Yet this has been true for barely 25 years. An institution that helped to spawn that possibility is the Museum of Modern Art, and a man centrally connected to that effort is William Lieberman, excuse me, the director of drawings at the Museum of Modern Art. It's a very special pleasure to have you here, Bill.
Thank you.
In September of 1929, a group of collectors and art patrons established a gallery in New York where for the first time in its history, there was a public gallery devoted exclusively to first-rate work by the masters of modern art, recent and contemporary. Their plan then was for their museum to hold about 20 exhibitions during the following 20 years, and their hope was that from this beginning, a permanent museum would grow. This year, their museum, the Museum of Modern Art, celebrates the 50th anniversary of its founding. You've been associated with the museum now for more than 35 years. In fact, made a very conscious decision early on to devote your career to the Museum of Modern Art. You've seen and known
several directors and
lots of exhibitions.
Yes.
Times have changed and tastes have changed. Can you start perhaps from the beginning and tell us some of the circumstances of the origin of the museum, its purpose, its function?
The Museum of Modern Art actually began near the pyramids, and there were three women, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, better known as Mrs. John D. Rockefeller Jr., Miss Lizzie Bliss, we later changed her name when she died to Lily, and Mrs. Cornelius Sullivan. And on their camels, by the Egyptian architecture, they really thought quite a bit about establishing a Museum of Modern Art in New York. And the first person they went to was A. Conga Goodyear, who at that time was connected with the museum at Buffalo, the Albright Gallery. Today it's called the Albright Knox Gallery. And they gradually, Barbara, as you know, gathered other people to them, opening with the first exhibition. It was the time of the crash in '29, and it was called quite simply First Loan Exhibition. Actually, it
just a week after the crash. I think it was November 7th or 8th, 1929. So it had a rather auspicious beginning.
But the First Loan Exhibition really set the tone of the museum and also the historical perspective of its collections, because it was devoted to the work of Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Seurat. And even today, that's where our collections begin. The next series of exhibitions...
it appointed its first director at that time as well.
A man called Alfred H. Barr, who had been a brilliant young student, first in Princeton, under Mather, had at two colleges outlined a very exciting way of teaching modern art as a discipline, including in his curriculum film and also photography. That doesn't sound so new stuff today, but I assure you, in 1928, when Alfred Barr was teaching, it was. He, of course, is Mr. Modern Art. and always will remain the most important person ever associated with our history. I can just rattle on indefinitely if you want. In the beginning, the emphasis was always on exhibitions, and that's a very great danger in my museum. Temporary exhibitions have a certain allure. There's always a new catalog and opening, and collections tend to be forgotten. Things that should be conserved or framed or matted belonging to the collection get pushed aside. It's always for the current exhibition. Paul J. Sachs, who was my teacher at FOG, was also called to be one of the founding trustees of the Museum of Modern Art. And from the outset, he insisted there be some sort of permanent collection. Paul Sachs was a marvelous person. He was a ham, very, very short man, and really taught about 3 generations of students at FOG, specifically in museum training. A bit of it was the history of the great American families and their fortunes, and that really was necessary at the time, because there is not one major museum in this country that does not owe its founding to really private fortunes. Times have changed, of course, today, and all institutions must seek funding elsewhere. But to get back to Uncle Paul, he gave us a gaggle of expressionist prints and one drawing by George Gross. The George Gross was not the sort of drawing you think of with George Gross. It was actually a portrait of his mother-in-law, and quite strangely, it was very flattering.
Bill, you mentioned Professor Paul Sachs, your professor, and who influenced you in your work greatly. Before that, your own tutor, W.H. Auden. Paul Sachs was one of the original 7 founders.
That's correct.
Of the museum. And obviously his sensibility and his taste affected very heavily the initial shape and direction. As I recall, however, the Department of Drawings was not established until you established it in 1971. It took a mighty long time in coming. When were drawings thought, when did drawings come to be appreciated at the Museum of Modern Art, and how did that come about?
Well, I personally, as a kid, had always been particularly interested in prints and drawings. The 2 most recent curatorial departments at the museum are the Department of Prints and the Department of Drawing.
They were once one department.
No, there was never a drawing department. There was once a print department, and then there was a print and drawing.
That's what.
But I found myself in 1971 also director of painting and sculpture, as well as director of drawings and prints, and it got really a bit too much. So I fractured off drawings into a separate department, and I think the museum did a very good thing to follow my recommendation.
How extensive is the Department of Drawings? What is the collection like, and what is its focus and its purpose?
It reflects, Barbara, in history, the collection of the museum itself. The 4 masters I mentioned before, the 4 masters of post-impressionism, we have drawings by those 4. Also drawings by younger people tend to be not so expensive, so we can stay more current very often than the painting and sculpture collection. The collection of drawings numbers, I forget what figure we give out. Let's say it's either 4,000 or 5,000. Any museum figures are baloney. For instance, I got Kupka years ago to give us 400 drawings.
They count as one, or
they're all
$3.99?
as one drawing. So figures like that are not really relevant. But I'm trying to do with drawings what I did with our print collection. It's the greatest collection of modern prints in the world, and I'm modestly trying to do it for the drawing collection.
What do you consider a drawing?
Well, I invented that
Define
ghastly
drawing.
word, work on paper, which just hounds me now.
I'll let you do a little revisionism. How would you define it now?
Well, I don't like them too big, but that's just me. To be serious, though, works on paper share common problems of conservation, not only how they were conceived, but how they should be stored, how they should be framed. And I think for a museum person, it's important to realize that. For instance, you wouldn't want your drawings all rolled up in sculpture storage. Also, drawings and prints, as probably most of you know, suffer from exposure to light. You saw our great Cézanne show. I'm sure almost everyone did see it who was here. You saw how glorious some of those Cézanne watercolors looked, and how completely faded others were. And now that we know more about light, which we didn't 20, 30 years ago, it really is the chief hazard for works on paper.
How do you deal with that problem?
Well, you find yourself not lending to every exhibition from wherever it's asked all over the world. One tries to show a drawing at the museum, say, only for 2 or 3 months of the year. One has a responsibility to an audience today, but also a very important responsibility to the audience of tomorrow.
What about ordinary men and women, collectors of both the precious and the nostalgic? How do you deal with a print or a drawing at home when it is exposed to ordinary daylight?
Don't have it in direct daylight. Any sort of light is bad. Fluorescent is the worst. If you can't take things and put them in the closet for a while or put them face to the wall, get what do you call it? A pillowcase. I mean, if it's small, get a pillowcase or a king-size pillowcase and have some friendly person just put loops on the corner, and you can put it over it. Let's say you're out of your house for 2 or 3 months running.
I assume that's becoming an increasingly serious problem because the quality of paper itself is becoming less and less.
That's true.
Good.
People often think that also a work of art on paper can be put in the dark for a while, and in some mysterious way it revives itself. That's baloney, of course.
As I mentioned earlier, you've devoted your entire career to the Museum of Modern Art. During the course of the time that you have been there, you've organized some 90 exhibitions.
It's about 100 now.
Really? Mm-hmm. Of drawings, theater arts and prints, and a dozen large loan exhibitions of painting and sculpture.
That's correct.
Including the retrospectives of Modigliani, Ernst, and Miro.
And Pollock.
And Pollock. That's a lot of pictures over a long period of time. Obviously, you've helped to shape and make taste. Mm-hmm. And obviously, too, there must be among that number some exhibitions that you consider to be more significant, more landmark, more milestone than others. In your opinion, with some hindsight obviously, what have been the most significant exhibitions that the museum in general has mounted and you personally have been involved with, and for what reasons?
Well, I think probably the Jackson Pollock show, because I extended his known work really a decade before abstract expressionism. I don't know how many of you saw the show, you all look so young, but it did show a decade's work before he painted in what became his well-known style. Also, that exhibition, if you studied it, suggested certain possibilities that should be re-examined in Pollock's own career. For instance, he was working with André Masson at Bill Hader's etching studio. First, Masson was next to him, and second of all, Bill Hader absolutely insisted on automatic techniques of engraving. Even earlier than that, Jackson had studied lithography with the printmaker across the river and had learned a touche technique of splattering on a stone. And if you look at things, they usually connect up.
Among the drawing exhibitions that you have been involved with, what are the most significant ones?
Well, it's very funny, Barbara. I always think the most significant shows a museum curator does are those that really pertain to the museum's collection.
I'm not talking about box office now,
Yeah,
but
no,
the very
that's what I
reason
mean.
that the museum was founded, and one hopes that its scholarship
Sure.
and conservation, all the public and private values that
Yeah.
we...
I'd say recently the Treasury of Modern Drawing, the Joan and Lester Avnet collection.
That is a collection that you were responsible for acquiring for the museum, but a very significant one. You also helped shape it, as I recall.
That's correct.
How do you decide, and what is the nature of the relationship between the collector and the museum, particularly when the
I
museum...
don't advise anyone unless they promise to give it to the museum. And that's the first thing. That's the relationship.
And how responsive are they to your instruction, generally?
That is not my concern, that's theirs.
I don't mean about the bequest, but in terms of developing a collection.
Oh, some people buy things they absolutely hate.
But they understand...
Oh, they like them later, usually.
Why do you think the Avnet collection is such an important collection?
Well, it fills many gaps that were in our collection to begin with. It was rich in symbolist drawings. It had a glorious gaggle of some, more than a gaggle, about 40 drawings by Dubuffet. Unfamiliar subjects by Modigliani. Wonderful drawings relating to our theater arts collection, drawings by Bakst, by Schlemmer. It had wonderful Picassos covering the first Cubist experience in Horta, straight through his freezing in the south of France during the Second World War. A show more directly limited to one theme was slightly before that, Seurat de Matisse, which was essentially the School of Paris. This thing for Australia didn't have any drawings in it.
What are the greatest omissions in terms of the museum's collection? If you found that next benefactor, what would you want those individuals to be purchasing? What doesn't the museum have that it should have?
I've been focusing recently, Barbara, on our American holdings. I don't think today, I mean, we all live in the heritage of Life magazine. Stuff from Israel looks like stuff from Holland. I mean, it's meaningless to have nationality separations. But I think for the first decades of the century, you can still speak of the School of Paris or American drawing. Our collection of American drawings for the first 5 decades of this century, it's very good, but it's not as good as it should be. We have nothing first-rate by Hartley. The omissions there are really quite surprising. I am, of course, trying to do my utmost to remedy that. We were very weak on Toby. Some of the omissions are quite glaring.
Of necessity, the museum's collection has to be viewed both as a European collection and an
International.
American
That
collection.
Alfred's basic premise was that the museum was international in scope. Sometime we pushed that too far. Countries whose names aren't even remembered are represented in the collection. On the other hand, Alfred wanted it that way, and his mistakes that way are really of interpretation and do not in any way blemish the essential collection itself.
And the other significant name in the history of the Museum of Modern Art, of course, is René Darnencourt. How did he want it?
Well, René was a man of great vision, not in the sense that Alfred Barr was a visionary, because Alfred really had the whole thing figured out. But René realized, and it was a very great thing to do, that his chief contribution to the museum would be by helping Alfred Barr. And Alfred was relieved of administrative responsibilities. René was a wonderful person. He always had time to see everyone.
I recall a line that you wrote at the time of the homage to René Darnencourt after his untimely death, and that appreciation contains an essay that you wrote. The first line is very striking, and it was René Darnencourt was not a scholar, he was a humanist. Mm-hmm. What did you mean?
Well, he was. Actually, René Darnencourt was an artist, and he arrived in the 1920s in Mexico. He had come from a wealthy Austrian family. who also had holdings of Slovenia, and he arrived at some obscure Mexican port where he was going to be apprenticed to someone. Whoever was picking him up wasn't there, and he got to know the Mexican community. Many of the artists remained his close friends, for instance, Tamayo, and then he came to the United States and worked trying to help the American Indians with their craft programs to instill some sort of artistic, not instill, but to renew some inherent artistic interest. Then he worked with Washington, and then he came to the attention of one of our very great people, Nelson Rockefeller, and through Nelson, he eventually came to the museum, succeeding Alfred Barr as our second director.
Nelson Rockefeller's mother was one of the founders of your museum, and from his very earliest days, I guess he was the son involved with the museum. In fact, he was a member of the first advisory council,
Yes.
part of the junior council, part of the international council, ultimately the president of the museum itself.
He was twice president and once chairman of the board.
How significant was his contribution to the museum, and what was the nature of that contribution?
Well, when he was still in his senior year at Dartmouth, this is in 1930, I assure you I wasn't around then, but in his senior year at Dartmouth, he became a member of the advisory committee, and I heard people talking about volunteer work before. The advisory committee consisted of 17 young people, frankly affluent usually, or well-placed, who were interested in a museum of modern art and its program and its collections. Then 2 years later, in 1932, Nelson became the first member of that advisory committee to be elected a trustee of the museum. And then on our 10th anniversary in '39, he succeeded A. Conga Goodyear, whom I mentioned before, as our second president. Nelson's relationship to the museum was always extremely intimate, and indeed his own collections grew as the museum's collections did.
And he promised some very extensive gifts to the museum.
He has promised extensive gifts, but during his lifetime he gave also extraordinary things. Our famous Matisse dance, the big version, is his gift in honor of Alfred H. Barr. You all know the Rousseau Dream. That was given early on. The three Boccioni States of Minds, works by Clay.
Is the museum aware of what his bequest was?
I can't hear you.
Is the museum aware
I still can't hear you.
Is there anything you care to share with us?
No.
Well, I guess we'll all know soon enough.
Sure.
At least that. In addition to being, I guess, fuzzy in that reply, there is a larger question that puzzles many of us. You mentioned earlier that Alfred Barr saw as the focus of the museum an international one. It seems that there is currently some confusion, at least among the public, about the museum and its current directions. Perhaps you might clarify some of that for us. The real question is how contemporary is modern?
I can answer that really not for the museum, but only for myself.
Yes.
And of course it's something that's a matter of concern. We're in the year 1971. That's 79. 20 years hence, are we going to be thinking of starting a museum of 21st century art? And where does your modern art begin? The original premise of the museum would be that it would surrender its collections gradually to the Metropolitan. That didn't work out. We can't always define modern art as beginning in 1880. A century later, that really is slightly ridiculous. However, your modern languages courses in universities at college, begin with Napoleon. Modern European history begins with Napoleon. So the actual definition of modern is quite hazy. In 1939, the Metropolitan did have works by Cézanne. They had none, though, by Van Gogh, Alfred actually recommended to them that they acquire Starry Night. They refused, and of course it's one of our treasures. They had nothing by Seurat. Today that picture has changed. The Metropolitan is very wealthy in pictures by Cézanne. They're very wealthy in pictures by Gauguin. They've got two marvelous Seurats. In other words, for the historical aspect of what we call modern art, the Metropolitan's collection is really greater than ours. I think it's sometimes a disservice too. You wish you could be czar of the New York art world for a minute just to help the public. You have the marvelous early Monets at the Metropolitan, but his great flowering, the water lilies, are at our place. You can't see the things in context.
So if you were king, you would?
Well, I would like to see all the museums in New York get together, which I assure you they never will, and try to think out what would be really best for the public.
Aren't there any gentlemen's agreements among the museums of New York? Who does what and when and where one focuses, at least in terms of acquisitions or collections?
I think curators are gentlemen only socially, Barbara.
What makes a work of art qualify for your museum?
Well, the very word you used, quality. And the new, people always think, oh dear, it's so new, how can I make up my mind? Well, any curator of modern art who is not open to looking really at anything and can't make some opinion of it isn't worth his salt. Often, of course, that opinion's going to be wrong. But on the other hand, it must be made. I mean, when Guernica was first shown here in New York, everyone, oh, you know, Picasso's going down the drain. Now, what, 40 years later, it's the masterpiece of the 20th century. One must be open, but one must be really very aware that one can make mistakes.
We know that traditional element in art criticism, and that is time.
Sure.
The nearly infallible critic that eliminates, at least to some degree, the probability of error. When we're talking about a museum of modern art, the Museum of Modern Art, the unique and foremost institution of its kind in the world, it had a place as the oracle of current history. It was an evangelical institution. Where does it all go?
What do you mean, where does it all go?
In what direction does the museum go? Both in terms of
I think we really have to
maintenance.
we have to not redefine but define what our museum is. I do wish that there would be serious thought given to that. Obviously, a modern museum can't just continue. It must sit down and evaluate itself every now and then.
Seems to me that most 50-year-olds take a time to take stock and reevaluate and redirect. Is that part of the current plan?
Not that I know of, Barbara. Museums, like especially new museums, are quite like people. They can also have menopause at the age of 50.
Well, let's talk about the more golden days,
Sure.
and that is what has been the effect of this, in many ways, very finely realized dream, the effect upon now a third generation of artists, collectors, the public, scholars, critics, colleges, galleries. Look what you had to wrought.
Well,
Europe, the whole reverse.
it is largely the Museum of Modern Art, but the important thing to realize, and I can't emphasize this enough, is it really is the greatness of the vision of Alfred Barr and his tremendous courage to carry it through. For instance, all our design shows, they're the classic shows, but when we showed machine-made art in 1932, you should look at what the papers and the magazines said. When we began our regular film programs, tremendous negative criticism. And I think if there's one thing that a curator can do, it's to help people look, and look as broadly as possible, and at as much as possible.
What's the most vital and the most significant function that the museum has fulfilled?
I think probably its historic shows. Take Alfred Barr's Cubism and abstract art, in the 30s, or his Dada, Surrealist, and Fantastic art, also in the 30s.
What did those shows do at that point in time that
They-
had not been done before, either visually or conceptually or intellectually, aesthetically?
They defined, for better or for worse, and it was for better, they defined those movements, and amazingly, almost at the time, placed them historically correctly, interpreted them correctly. I mean, those early books of Alfred are still the definitive works in the colleges that many of you have been at. That tradition continues. Bill Rubin's great Late Cezanne show. Think of the amount of words that have been written by Cezanne. But it was Bill Rubin and his two colleagues really re-examining the late work that made that very, very exciting show. That's what I mean by a great historical show.
In addition to the Dada and Surrealism, are there others that you would number in that list?
Well, we're dedicated to a program of continuing American exhibitions, and as I say, at that time, it was still possible to do, say, just an American show. But they had horrible names: 14 Americans, 12 Americans, 23 Americans,
Yes.
and you get thoroughly confused.
Where are they now?
Well, some of those catalogs are pretty grim to look back at. But on the other hand, the people who were shown first really are considerable. A show like this, which was one of our old-time box office hits, wasn't even supposed to be shown at the museum.
I guess it was one of the nightmares that curators fear, but that turned out very well for the people of New York, because you would never have had that exhibition.
No, it was originally done for a 2-month showing in Australia. You must remember, in Australia, it was the first time that an original work by Matisse had been shown. And there's tremendous thirst for the visual arts in Australia, and also, fortunately, with an enlightened art council, the money to support that thirst.
There are certain departments of the museum that are very well known: sculpture and painting, prints and drawings, photography, film, publications. There are some assets that the museum has that the general public, in fact even the art public,
Doesn't know.
is not aware of.
That's quite true.
One of them you are intimately involved with. I'm thinking of the Theater Arts
That's right.
Collection. Can you describe that for us, and why don't we know more about it?
Money.
Is it that simple?
Sure.
You didn't have money problems until the most recent period. You've had that collection for a long time.
Yes, but I just know. I've been articulating it now over a period of about 25 years. As Barbara says, we have several hidden collections or unknown collections at the museum. One of them is our great collection of illustrated books, books illustrated with original works of art by leading painters and sculptors. This is also true to the collection that Barbara has just mentioned, our theater arts collection. And that is...
Did you ever acquire a theater arts collection when there are other repositories that are so well known? I'm thinking of the Museum of the City of New York, the library at Lincoln
yes,
Center.
I can explain.
Came after- yes.
I can explain that.
Please.
Our collection of theater arts is not devoted to the work of the commercial or even very great set designer. It is devoted to the original designs of leading painters and sculptors. And other collections, let's say, don't own Chagall's 40 watercolors for Laco.
or Braque or Matisse
yeah,
designing
exactly.
for a production. And who developed that collection?
Well, the person who originally focused on it was another very great man associated with the museum. You've probably been reading about him in the papers recently, Lincoln Kirstein. Lincoln's vision of a theater arts collection was somewhat smaller. It was devoted primarily to the dance, but since then it has incorporated theater, and the holdings, although not enormous, Barbara, are rather extraordinary.
You should say a word for a moment about Lincoln Kirstein,
Sure.
a man whose life really has touched more excellences
Yes, extraordinary.
than very many people. Lincoln Kirstein was one of the original members of the advisory council. I guess he and Eddie Warburg, and who was the third at Harvard, were very involved in the founding of the Museum of Modern Art. He's one of the founders of the New York City Ballet and continues to play a significant role as Mr. Balanchine, is a biographer.
And directed frequent shows for us. The first,
Foreign Correspondent?
The first Novelman show, another show, American Realists and Magic Realists. Barbara mentioned Harvard. It was an extraordinary class. There was Eddie Warburg there, Lincoln not actually enrolled, I believe, at the university. The best curator of anything in this country, Hyatt Mayer, was there. And as undergraduates, they published that very great magazine, Hound and Horn, every issue of which I commend to anyone who's interested in literature. Lincoln, Nelson, and Alfred were also responsible for our very large Latin American collection. Lincoln has touched almost every aspect of the museum.
Excluding the Museum of Modern Art, which do you consider the world's greatest museums of modern art? And which would you recommend for aesthetics, installation, collection, outreach, their interest in the avant-garde?
Well, the trouble there is we are really top banana. I mean, no one simply can get that concentration of the key masterworks. The Beaubourg, the Pompidou Center at Beaubourg, of course, should be seen. It's a rather dangerous museum to visit, I admit. They have great strength in some of their collections. For instance, we're terribly weak in Kandinsky, and he's much better represented at Beaubourg, and of course at the Guggenheim Museum here. But they can't have the Demoiselle d'Avignon, they can't have the Rousseau Sleeping Gypsy. Those are really all at our factory.
What are the best installations? Lighting, environment?
I think probably in Japan.
Well, actually, you have been singularly responsible for introducing many aspects of Japanese art.
That's right.
To this country. Can you tell us about some of that? The exhibitions that you've held, both here and there. How did that all come about? How did you become so involved in Japan?
Well, so often I get summoned at the last minute, but one gets used to that. And another museum was planning, this is quite true, San Francisco Museum was planning a contemporary Japanese show and wanted to do it with us. And they came to us for advice, and we just took over the idea of the show. I happened to be going to Japan to judge a print biennale. This is when I was curator of prints, which I'd helped them set up. And so one was assigned to case to see what could be taken from Japan and shown here. One of the directives I received, though, was that such an exhibition, which I subsequently called the New Japanese Painting and Sculpture, one of the directives were that there could be nothing that was on paper. Well, to anyone rudimentarily informed about Japanese art, the exclusion of paper, is ridiculous. I did find an extraordinary printmaker there called Masuo Ikeda, and since they didn't let me put him in the big show, I simply gave him a small one-man show of his own work. The Japanese, for almost every aspect of their life, and this is true throughout their history, need the force of foreigners. You must remember, for instance, all your Japanese food was really invented by the Portuguese or the Dutch. They needed Perry. They always have to be forced, and it is easier for them to have aggression or help from the outside to define what they're doing. A Japanese curator, well, it's changing now.
You discussed that view with Stephen Sondheim?
No. A Japanese curator wouldn't think of going to an artist studio. I mean, it's, just not done. This is terribly difficult for a Japanese artist working in a Western style in Japan. I mean, he does big, big paintings, but he lives in this little place, and it's got, paper walls. Where the hell do you put a painting? In that small area, he has to make and raise a family, cook. Space is a terrible problem in Japan for any creative artist. Also, the Japanese work by committee, and committee, I assure you, is the worst possible way to organize an exhibition. But it lets everyone off the hook in Japan if you have, say, 12 people. And I didn't speak a word of Japanese then, and I simply insisted at looking at things and not taking recommendations. Some of those artists have become better known.
Who are some of them?
Nagare, who even today is unrecognized as a sculptor in Japan, and well, Noguchi isn't Japanese, but Nagare certainly is the most distinguished living sculptor. The most interesting artist I found there, Shinohara, because of lack of space and poverty, would do things and then destroy them. And this was not with any minimal or newfangled intent. He didn't have any place to put them. No one would take them.
Continually amazed at the amount of new work by younger artists that you personally see in this country. Mm-hmm. We keep on hearing statistics, and we see evidence all around us that there are 30,000 art makers in this city, and 4,000 in that city, and 300 in this little pocket of civilization. And we know that to be an art maker is now an acceptable bourgeois occupation. But then comes that other question that we touched on briefly before, and that is the whole question of quality. We know there's a great deal of activity, but how much of it is of vitality and concerned with quality?
Well, I can only give you my personal opinions, Barbara. I think it's very bad that kids can go and be graduated from college as an artist. I think it's appalling they can do graduate work. Even printmaking, that is not the role of a college, and I really can think of practically no artist of any significance that has been...
Frank Stella, who came out of college. He's probably the only one.
But it's really quite curious. You take printmaking, people get graduated all over with MAs or BAs in printmaking. That doesn't make them a printmaker. I mean, it's like majoring in English. You get graduated, that doesn't make you English.
What advice would you give to an artist? What advice would you give to an artist who's trying to make...
I quite sincerely believe that the artist is a superior being. And I do think if you're going to be an artist, it doesn't matter whether you're taught or not. You may be led to being taught, but it will express itself. It will be the most important thing in your life, dominating it, to the exclusion, really, of all other things. I think too few laymen know really how difficult it is.
I assume you define artist in that sense, in the broadest sense of the word.
Yes, but just think of sitting down in front of a blank canvas and doing something. I mean, it's very humble making to think there are people who can do that. Or beginning with a little bit of clay.
You've certainly devoted your life to the museum.
Sure.
In fact, I guess my favorite anecdote, I mentioned it to you recently, was when a new employee came to the museum, someone asked Bill Lieberman, how do they think this employee would work out? And he said, it's going to be terrific. I saw him here on Sunday. How should a stranger who is at the Museum of Modern Art for the first time or the 10th time, but for an afternoon, take the most advantage of its riches?
I think go immediately to the second floor and begin with the permanent collection. And then the third floor where the permanent collection continues. Too many people come in just for our loan exhibitions on the first floor, and they are better attended than the collection floors. But I think for someone new at the museum, you do get your frame of reference if you see the collection first. Those floors, unfortunately, are truncated by, in the midst of, let's say, Matisse, the galleries devoted to architecture and design, or abstract expressionism. On the third floor, tapers out with the galleries of prints and drawings and photography. That's unfortunate. That's because our physical plant wasn't really designed to cope properly with all that. But I think it is the collection that is the basic frame of reference.
You bring up another question of compelling contemporary interest, and that is the physical plant. Seems that the Museum of Modern Art has figured out a way to get itself some new operating income by creating a cultural trust and selling air rights to build a largely commercial structure over the building. Can you tell us some
It's
of
not over the building, Barbara.
a new building,
Yeah.
but it will be over the building because the lower floors of that building will also be a museum.
You have the present museum and its garden. We own a lot of property down toward 6th Avenue.
Now, practically all of it.
Yeah, the schematic drawing that was in the New York Times looked as if the tower was right over the garden. I assure you that's not true. With the extension towards 6th
But the
Avenue...
shadow of that tower is on over the garden.
I don't think so.
I'm afraid
I
it
think the
is.
garden will be better, actually, because
The garden may be better.
floor,
I think it will be because you will be, one, to explain what you'll be doing with the two sides, and that one side of the garden is really an unrealized design at this time, the upper level.
the upper level will be made more useful, but the actual facade of the museum looking into the garden also will be terraced, and terraced on, I think it's 3 or 4 floors, really looking quite beautiful. About the garden, so few people realize we're a private museum. The Met, for instance, gets about $4.5 million from the city a year. We don't get a penny from them.
Well, it wasn't until recent times that you even dared to think of even
That's right.
asking. I mean, that you indeed thought of yourself as a very private museum as well. But what do you think of this precedent-setting move of the museum taking in boarders? How do you feel about that?
Well, it's not taking in boarders. We'll more than double our space because in this new building, which again, as I said, is toward 6th Avenue, we will have unrestricted use and also complete charge of the design of the first 6 floors, which will simply be a lateral extension of our present 6 floors.
How much of that space will be given, for example, to the Department of Drawings?
For the first time, all departments will have adequate, so to speak, display space. That sounds grand and glorious. If you're an old worrywart like me, though, I believe that a Museum of Modern Art, especially a Museum of Modern Art, the visitor should be able to encompass the whole caboodle in one visit. I mean, they can, sure, they can stop and study whatever they want, but if you fracture the thing too much and make it too large, I think that can be a danger, Barbara.
What happens when, during the period of construction, you will both be having a period of construction and the celebration of a 50th anniversary, which are not accidental because obviously that construction will also serve as the fulcrum of a massive fundraising drive. What happens to the museum then? Do you close? Where do you mount exhibitions?
Obviously, at some time we will have to close. No one at the museum can tell you that date, absolutely no one. How much of the museum will have to close, again, is an unknown factor, since all this building will be done toward 6th Avenue. The problem, Barbara, has been thought out in many, many ways, and I think none of them have offered satisfactory solutions. Obviously, you don't want great masterworks adjacent to where dynamiting might be. I mean, just gives you the willies.
Actually, the fire that took place, and I'm loath to bring it up at the
It's all
Museum
right.
of Modern Art, that related to the, I guess, the Monet Shrine, took place during a construction
Yes, and
accident.
the only completely fireproof museum in America at that time had that fire. It doesn't make sense. And we had been not investigated, approved you know, they come around regularly just a week before. The principal damage during the fire was done by the fire department. The former Monet water lilies was not destroyed by fire. It was destroyed by firemen hacking through it.
Were you there at the time?
Yes, I was.
And there was obviously
Alfred and I physically removed the Seurat show. I mean, there was the distinct possibility that Seurat's entire work would disappear. And Alfred, although he looks frail, is much stronger than I am. We got through, and I just passed out cold. But it was a terrible, terrible experience. And especially when you are borrowing from other people in other museums, every possible precaution must be made. When I borrowed these masterworks for Australia, there were two people, one a conservationist and another person curatorially, who inspected that show 3 times a day. I mean, for me, it was a ghastly time to spend. But also many of the smaller museums, or in Australia, the great museums, are not familiar about security problems. For instance, I asked in Melbourne, what is it to the guards whom I addressed? Incidentally, any museum person must get on and know on a first-rate basis the people he works with, not just the top bananas, but the workmen, the framers, the guards. But I said, what is the last thing you do before you close up? And they, what do you mean? And, well, of course, it is going to the restrooms. I mean, it is traditionally the easy place to conceal a person or a bomb. And, you know, strangely enough, they had never heard of that. The problems of guarding works of art, I think, is something that no museum in America really has solved, probably no museum anyplace. In Beaubourg, you see them touching the frame, audience touching the frame and shaking the pictures. Also, I think it'd be wonderful if one could have guards who are informed. I don't
Why can't they be artists?
No. Our artists have usually, no, Flavin was a guard.
Robert Ryman was a guard at the Museum of Modern Art.
Well, I keep thinking Jimmy Ernst worked in the mailroom, but...
Can you take a moment and tell us, we only have several minutes remaining, what your plans are for the 50th anniversary year? I know you're going to be intimately involved, and particularly you're always called in at the last minute, and it's just about that time. What will you be doing? What are some of the major plans for the year-long celebration?
Most museum people complain about working under pressure. I'm one of them. Actually, one does better work. When I was faced with doing an anniversary show on the occasion of the museum's 50th anniversary, I thought it most important to emphasize the collections. We have also many curatorial departments, in other words, departments concerned with varying disciplines. And the exhibition will be called Arts of the 20s, and it will be as if we opened in 1929, as indeed we did, with an exhibition that surveyed the past decade in painting, printmaking, sculpture, drawing, film, architecture and design, posters, photography.
You are organizing that.
Film program. And the extraordinary gimmick is that on the occasion of our 50th anniversary, it will show the great wealth of the collections, because everything in the whole caboodle is from the museum's collection. And I think will be really a terrific show. Also a time to look at things that people have forgotten. It's always good to goose up people a tiny bit.
Are there any surprise? We noticed something in newspaper comments, there was going to be a Picasso exhibition from one part of the museum to the other. Is that still going to take place?
We're not dead certain. The director of my museum, Richard Oldenburg, will be conferring with the French officials in Paris on February 19th. The Picasso show started as first a show of Picasso's Picassos. Well, of course you can't show those until the Picasso estate is settled. The Picasso estate is settled. By that I mean the number.
Can they be shown here before they're shown in France?
No, absolutely not. But the painting, the works of art that go into each of one of those sections has not yet been determined. And overriding all of that is the absolute necessity that the contents of the Picasso Museum in Paris be established. None of this has been spelled out yet. But I hope when Oldenburg, and he's traveling with Bill Rubin, I hope when they come back immediately after the 19th, we will be able to really announce a Picasso show.
Are you a collector, Bill?
Yes.
What do you collect?
I collect silver boxes of the 17th and 18th century, and I collect something called Yokohama prints, which, you know, Japanese ukiyo-e, those old prints were really gossip columns. They showed you the latest actor, the latest whore, things like that. And then, when Perry came, the students of Hiroshige and Kuniyoshi flocked to the port of Yokohama, the newly opened foreign port, and drew these strange foreigners. And it's a fascinating footnote in history. It has nothing to do with my period. I feel very strongly, incidentally, Barbara, that no curator of modern art, well, no curator at all, should collect in his own field.
What is your most prized possession?
I suppose the Rodin statue of Nijinsky, which I have lent to this Diaghilev show at the Metropolitan.
When did you acquire that?
I don't know. It's when I was doing the Max Ernst show. What a terrible way to tell time.
But your time is all. One last question. Is there, actually I think my last question is, you mentioned earlier that they were thinking of shipping all those paintings off to the Metropolitan Museum, and they never succeeded in doing that. Rumor has it that the Metropolitan is finally going to get even. Instead of taking the paintings, they're going to take the director. I'm thinking of you. There is much talk that you have been invited to be the new director of contemporary art at the Metropolitan Museum. Is there any truth to that rumor, and is there a possibility to its happening?
I can only answer that by saying I have refused the job at the Tate Gallery.
Thank you, Bill Lieberman, for being with us. I hope you will be with us for a very long time. Obviously, your charm is only exceeded by your scholarship and your wit. Thank you very much, and thank you on his
Thanks, Bill.
And now what we do is we ask the class to join in the conversation. See if you can do better with several of those questions than I could. You have your cues. If you have a question, won't you please raise your hand, and I will call on you, and if you'd care to, identify yourself by name. Are there any questions? The woman in the center.
Yes. I'm keeping very still, and I was wondering what your interest would be now that China has opened up, and what you plan, or if you do plan on collecting art from China.
Ms.